Once let the black man get upon his person the brass letters US. Let him get an eagle on his button, and a musket on his shoulder, and bullets in his pocket. And there is no power on earth or under the earth that can deny that he has earned the right to citizenship. Frederick Douglass, April 6, 1863. Free African Americans in Lawrence County, Illinois, in the hope of making life better and ending slavery, enlisted and fought in the Civil War, mostly in the 28th US Colored Infantry. This is their story. Lawrence County, Illinois is located on the banks of the Wabash River, across from Vincennes, Indiana, where Abraham Lincoln first entered Illinois in 1830. African American pioneers had been living here before Illinois was even a state. They may not have been owned by whites like they were in the South before the Civil War, but they did not enjoy the same rights or privileges as their white neighbors did. The early so-called Illinois Black Laws required that all African Americans file with the court and carry a certificate of freedom with a physical description of themselves. Without one, that person was deemed a runaway and subject to arrest and sale. By 1851, Illinois had passed laws effectively barring any further free African Americans from entering the state. Oliver Russell was a free African American. He was born April 7, 1847, to parents from the slave state of Kentucky. By the 1860s, his father headed one of many free African American families who owned real estate in the county. As one of 4 brothers who served in the Civil War, only Oliver lived to be called an old soldier.
My name is Oliver Russell, and I was born and raised in a free colored settlement in Lawrence County, Illinois, on the Allison Prairie, close to the Wabash River. Now, most of our folks were descendants of slaves. However, many of us were considered mulattoes. We were mostly farmers who owned their own land. And in those days, growing up in Lawrence County was not easy for anyone, especially for us colored folks. You see, our white neighbors didn't want us living there to begin with, mainly because of the color of our skin. Living in fear was just a normal part of our life. Back in those days, runaway slaves would come up the Wabash River searching for freedom. And kidnappers would come along and snatch them up and sell them back into slavery. Oh my, our folks were scared to death of those kidnappers.
And around the year 1855, the law wouldn't allow any Negroes to enter into the state of Illinois.
Well, there was a free Negro by the name of William Brown who lived over in Vincennes, Indiana. And he came over to Lawrenceville to do some work. Well, Sheriff Watts arrested him for not having his papers, and he couldn't pay his fine. So the sheriff threw him in jail. A few days later, the sheriff tried to auction him off right on the courthouse steps. My, it was just like a slave auction in the South. Oh my, it sure made our folks uncomfortable. Yeah, oh my. The sheriff couldn't find any bidders on Mr. Brown, so he told him to get back over into Vincennes, Indiana. Now that happened right there on our county courthouse steps. And you know, just a few years later, that same William Brown ended up in the Union in the Civil War.
By 1862, the Civil War had fractured racial relationships, not just in war-torn states, but also in Lawrence County. That year, Matthias Anderson, a free African American, was viciously murdered by a group of copperheads.
You know, there's just some things in this old world that you never forget. It was the year 1862. I was 15 years old. There was a colored man in our neighborhood by the name of Matthias Anderson, and we called him Sug. His family lived about 7 miles northeast of Lawrenceville, as the crow flies. Now, Sug Anderson was murdered by a gang of white Southern sympathizers, and they were called Copperheads. His body was found in the cold woods. He was shot, stabbed several times, and his body was just mangled. Everyone around knew and loved Sug Anderson. He was just 32 years old. He had a wife, Lizzie, and 3 young children, and they were just devastated. Oh, it was just a horrible time for all of our folks, and it shook up the whole neighborhood. And you know, nothing ever did happen to those copperheads.
The African American community of Lawrence County was not isolated from the news of national events. They read the newspapers of the day and listened as speakers in their churches talked about national rights. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln changed the law allowing African Americans to enlist in the Union Army, creating a sense of pride and patriotism throughout the African American community.
On November the 30th, 1863, the War Department authorized Indiana Governor Oliver Morton to organize a regiment of black soldiers. William Miller, a Vincennes resident, began recruiting our local African American men from Lawrence County to join the Union ranks.
The year was 1863, and I was living with my brother Horace in Tippecanoe County, Indiana. And we both enlisted into the Army on December the 28th. Now, back home in Lawrence County, our folks were concerned about our boys going to war, but they were so very proud of them. And most of them had never been out of Lawrence County anyway. You know, there was a new recruiter from Vincennes, Indiana, and he was a white feller. They say he was a pretty good feller, and his name was William Miller. And his job was to put the new recruits on a train and make sure they got to Indianapolis. Well, we all ended up at Camp Fremont. It was a mighty big place with soldiers as far as you could see. The weather had turned bad that year. The winter was extremely cold. Oh, it was bitter cold. And there was a young Negro doctor by the name of Willis Rebels. And he examined us from head to toe. Now, they put all of us colored soldiers together. Of course, we had some white officers, and they were pretty rough on us. Our uniforms didn't fit, and our military gear wasn't the best, and our pay wasn't even equal to the whites. And by then, I was getting pretty homesick, and oh, how I missed my ma's a-cooking. Well, they taught us how to march and to obey orders, and they taught us how to fight like a soldier. We were a long way from Lawrence County, but we were mighty proud. They called us the 28th US Colored Troops.
Even though the 28th Regiment was commanded by white officers, several of the Lawrence County men held enlisted leadership positions as sergeants and corporals, but most served as privates. On April 25, 1864, 6 companies of the 28th left Indianapolis for Camp Casey in Washington, D.C., to assist with defending the capital. In July 1864, the unit was involved in skirmishes outside of Petersburg and accompanied General Sheridan's cavalry in their march through Chickahominy swamps toward Richmond. On June 23, 1863, they participated in a skirmish at Jones Bridge. Sergeant William Day of Lawrence County was killed in action. He was the first soldier of the 28th to fall.
The year 1864 was one of the hardest years of my life. I saw for the first time the wickedness of slavery. I lost two of my brothers, Jimmy and Erasmus, at Camp Fremont. They had both died of disease. This was so hard on me. At the famous Jones Bridge, we lost the first man in our outfit. He was Sergeant William Day. I grew up with him on the Allison Prairie. I felt so sorry for his wife and child back home. And my brother Horace hugged me tightly and told me that we're going to get through this. By now, our 28th outfit was getting to know each other pretty well. Oh, we laughed together and we sang together. We even told stories and cried together. These were now my brothers.
The first major engagement for the 28th was to be the Battle of the Crater at Petersburg, Virginia, July 30, 1864.
In an effort to break the stalemate at Petersburg, the Union High Command authorized digging a 500-foot tunnel underneath Confederate lines and exploding a huge powder charge. The plan was then to rush the dazed Confederates and create a breach in the enemy's defenses. The 28th was originally set to be part of the lead division in the assault. However, on the evening before the battle, their division, made up entirely of black regiments, was relegated to a second assault wave. At about 5 o'clock in the morning, the mine exploded, and almost immediately chaos ensued. Confederates recovered from the shock of the explosion much more quickly than anyone anticipated and unleashed a deadly counterfire. By the time Russell's comrades joined the fight, the situation was hopeless and horrendous. The 28th lost about half of its men, including 2/3 of its officers. Years later, General Grant called the affair a stupendous failure.
What was the crater like? Oh, the Battle of the Crater will be forever etched in my mind. I was assigned to the ambulance corps and drove a wagon with a team of mules. My military duty was to transport the wounded. Now, several of my friends from home were shot up and injured on that awful day, like my brother Horace Russell, Eddie Pettiford, William Brown, and Eddie Sims, who was trampled during the retreat. And two of our Lawrence County boys were killed on that day, Sammy Cole and Jimmy Taylor. Oh my. Our regiment was so blessed to have a special chaplain by the name of Garland White. He always carried his Bible, and he was such a comfort to us all, especially to those soldiers who took their last breath and went on to glory. Nowadays, I see visions of bloody and mangled soldiers early in the morning. I still hear the thunder of cannons and the men screaming and crying and begging for water. I continue to hear those squeaky old wagon wheels on them dark, foggy nights. Oh my, I see those old hospital tents where I delivered my precious cargo. I can't seem to eliminate those visions from my soul.
After the crater, the 28th participated in other battles and was one of the first regiments to march into the city of Richmond. Since sanitary conditions were poor for Civil War soldiers and worse for African American soldiers, many became ill several times during their service. Disease killed 4 men from Lawrence County, including Levi Tan, who died of pneumonia resulting from a complication of typhoid fever. Wiley Pettiford's military service consisted mostly of time in various hospitals. He was listed as being a patient at least 8 times.
With the end of the Civil War, the 28th was assigned to various stations along the Texas-Mexican border as part of the U.S. response to French intervention there. The 28th was mustered out of service at Corpus Christi in November 1865, and many of the men returned to Indianapolis in January of the following year for a reception in their honor.
Oh, how it felt so good to be back home on that old Allison Prairie, to see the faces of our family and friends. They were so proud of us. We began the yearly Juneteenth celebrations at the Cold Woods, just east of Pinkstaff. There was always lots of music and dancing and storytelling. A life after the war was not all good times. Being colored was still an issue, and we continued to be second-class citizens. After the war, there were still places that we were not allowed to go. There were Negro lynchings in the South, and there were a few around here. We had fought so hard in the war for the right to citizenship, but our rights were being denied. However, I still have hope for our future generations. I thought about some of my 28 comrades who were home now, sick in mind and body, and they were unable to work. My friend Levi Goins was blinded in one eye while building a stable for an officer. Oh, Levi had such a hard time getting his pension. As for me, I am haunted with those dark memories. War is so brutal, and it has taken its toll on all of us.
Black veterans were eligible for pension benefits just like their white counterparts, but often had greater difficulty successfully applying because of a lack of documentation or of local assistance. We know of at least one local black veteran of the 28th, Levi Goins, who was actually prosecuted and imprisoned for pension fraud. It took a pardon from President Benjamin Harrison to finally resolve his case.
Oliver Russell moved to Carrier Mills, Illinois about 1894, where he died at age 64 in 1911, just one of the men from Lawrence County who served with the 28th Colored Troops and who was proud to have worn an eagle on his button. Since the Civil War, African American men from Lawrence County have played a role in every military conflict involving the United States. I am bound to them, though I cannot see them or hear their voices. I honor their history. I cherish their lives. I will tell their story. I will remember them.
Hello, my name is Sean Curry. I'm a physician in the United States Army Medical Corps. I'm also a proud son of Lawrence County. I'm honored to hold the title of and be known as the great-great-great-grandson of Oliver Russell. In my time in the military, I've heard many stories about bravery, sacrifice, and courage. However, most pale in comparison to the trials and tribulations that faced the 28th Regiment. From their lowest of lows, as with their devastating losses at the Battle of the Crater, to their highest of highs in their triumphant return to Indianapolis in 1866, the men of the 28th Regiment will forever be remembered as the bold and the brave. Since the ending days of the Civil War, service members, such as those in the 28th Regiment, have paved the way for Black Americans in Lawrence County and all over this great nation to take up the title of defender and at times pay the ultimate sacrifice to ensure the liberties that we have all grown so accustomed to. The men of the 28th Regiment have afforded us the opportunity to push forward and ultimately allow those who have followed in their footsteps the opportunity to earn an eagle on their button.